yeah, we're going to jump in here.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Caleb. And I am getting a message that's saying participant screen sharing is disabled. But while we work out those technical difficulties, I just want to say it's a real pleasure to join you all this morning, this afternoon. It was great to see. It's great to join with Caleb as a fellow Tennessean. Before coming to Washington, D.C., I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. And then also seeing some church planters on the call. So it's really great to join you all. And okay, great. I've got it. I can share now. But also just really thrilled for this group that you all have started, Nazarenes for Creation Care. So important, so exciting, and just really excited to see that. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen now. And yeah, I am presenting to you today on how to pro-life and clean energy, and essentially coming at this issue as a matter of life, coming at caring for creation, coming at clean energy as a matter of life, which may not be the first thing that you think of whenever clean energy comes to mind, which can sometimes be a little bit of a wonky thing. And so today I really wanted to couch it first in how clean energy and caring for creation is critical to our discipleship process, how it's critical for advancing life, partnering with Jesus in his call and mission to bring abundant life, and then just get to the nuts and bolts of some practical ways that you can act out your Christian witness, your Christian discipleship through clean energy. So let's get started. I wanted to start with just laying this foundation that caring for creation actually isn't a radical new idea, but it's foundational to our faith. And many of you may already know that and appreciate that. But I think in our broader dialogue in our churches with our family and friends, it can feel like when we talk about environmental stewardship, that this is some newfangled idea that we're adding to our Christian witness, that it's a political issue, it's something from the culture wars. But really, when we look at it, it is foundational, not radical. And we only have to look in the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, where God gives us that first commission to take responsibility for all he has made. He says, let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature. So we're made in the Imago Dei so that we can be responsible for everything else on earth that God has made. The fish in the sea, the birds in the air, and even ourselves, fellow humans. And so that is an awesome responsibility and task that God has given us, that is as we are acting out in obedience to him, so important for us to not neglect. And then we see calls for environmental stewardship throughout Scripture, not only in Genesis 1, but also in Genesis 2, to tend and keep, all the way through the Old Testament and into the New Testament, where we see that our redemption or the redemption of a fallen creation is tied to our salvation in Christ. We see the promise that Christ is reconciling all things to himself, both in heaven and on earth, and that God's going to make all things new with the coming of Christ, the new heavens and the new earth. And so we see this call all throughout Scripture. Another thing is that caring for creation is actually a key part of the history and heritage of the Christian church. I love pointing back to since the very beginning with one of the earliest churches, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, since the 4th century, continuing to today, is still living out that call and responsibility, and an awesome assignment God has given us to be those good stewards. They have as they look at what you'll notice on your screen is in the middle of this patch of forest, there's a building, and that's the church. And the church has seen the land around it as also part of their church. And you'll notice a fence around the forest and around the patch of trees, and all around it is desolate from desertification, from overgrazing practices, but whatever was in the walls of the church within those fenced in grounds is still thriving. And now you'll see this dotted across the landscape of Ethiopia, where you see these pockets of biodiversity that have been preserved because the church has protected and preserved them. And now they've become really important hotspots for biodiversity of helping reverse the impacts of desertification in the area by expanding out their walls and letting the forest continue to grow. So we see this legacy, this heritage, this history of caring for creation from the very beginning. Looking to theology and a bit more recent, we can see John Calvin calling us to be good stewards, saying that with respect to those good things that God has given us to enjoy, let everyone regard himself as a steward of God in all the things that he possesses. Then he will neither conduct himself dissolutely nor corrupt by abuse by those things which God requires to be preserved. We see this with the rise of the Protestant church. And what's really exciting is I read this incredible book by historian Mark Stoll over at Texas Tech called Inherit the Holy Mountain, The Rise of and the Religion and Rise of American Environmentalism, and where he posits and shows this incredible history of how the American conservation and environmental movements actually being birthed out of Reformed Protestant theology. And he writes that the Reformed Protestant branch of the Christian tradition has been treating the environment as a religious concern for nearly 5 centuries. When we think of environmental problems like global warming and so many others, we think of them as secular issues, but history reminds us that they have always been moral issues. And you can see in this of how the first Puritan settlers in New England lived out this stewardship ethic by putting in place local policies to protect the common areas for the next generation. You can even trace roots of the national park system to the Presbyterian branch of in denomination, and again coming out of this Reformed Protestant theology. And I grew up as a Methodist, so not to leave out John Wesley. He also speaks to the stewardship of being a good steward, saying that we are now God's stewards and that we're indebted to him for all that we have. And going on to say that we use them with restraint, that we use them not for our own purposes, but according to the directions that our master God has given us in his word. And even Billy Graham gets in on the game and makes this call for stewardship, especially noting that Psalm 24, that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and all who live in it. And so when he writes, as we fail to see the world as God's creation, we will end up abusing it. Selfishness and greed take over, and we end up not caring about the environment or the problems we're creating for the next generation. And so we really see this as part of our long arc of the history of the church of caring for creation. I'll also say that caring for creation today is also a discipleship issue and really key to us living out. We're all called when we answer the call to follow Christ, that we're called to live out the greatest commandment in Matthew 22, as well as to serve the least of these, as it says, as Jesus commands us in Matthew 25. And so as we think about this of loving God, loving our neighbor, loving the least of these, I love this quote from Francis Schaeffer, that if I love the lover, who's God, I love what the lover has made. This is an act of obedience and honor to God. And that by loving our neighbor and the least of these, this is part of it, is ensuring that everyone has that healthy environment where they can all thrive and have that abundant life that Jesus came to give, as he states in John 10:10. And then it also gets us to the main point of this talk, which is caring for creation is a matter of life. It's a matter of living out our pro-life ethic here in the 21st century. And that pro-life ethic of, this is how at EEN we define it, as in accordance with the National Association of Evangelicals and even the March for Life, that we are to defend and preserve life at every stage, from conception to natural death. And when we look at the best available science, what we are finding is that, just as Billy Graham was saying, our failure to care for creation leads to problems that cause us to fail to care for life, to fail to care for the next generation that is here with us today and that are to come. And so just to dive into this, I just want to state, pollution is not a problem of the past. Even though we can't see it now, it can feel like that was a problem from decades ago that we don't deal with now. But the truth is, according to the American Lung Association, nearly half of Americans live in areas of unhealthy air polluted by smog and soot. And these culprits, smog and soot, you'll hear it or see it throughout the presentation of referred to as, for soot, particulate matter, which also includes smoke and dirt and dust. And so tiny particles that often that we can't see that we're breathing in that impact our lungs and impact all of our bodies. Smog may also be referred to as ozone. And again, this is this is a gas that we can't see. There's also volatile organic compounds, and they turn into smog in the presence of heat and sunlight. And this causes a raft of health effects. And so pollution, again, with these health effects, it's not harmless, even though we can't usually see it. Maybe in this COVID season, we can appreciate it a bit more, that all of a sudden, when activities died down and we went into lockdown, we could actually feel that presence of, or the absence of the pollution that was blocking the views of skylines, of mountains. We may have all seen those pictures, but it is there with us and it is not harmless. Medical research shows that this is a matter for children, especially born and unborn, that soot, smog, particulate matter, ozone is linked to an increased risk for preterm birth, low birth weights, and even stillbirths in pregnancy. And we see that here in the United States, Black mothers and babies are especially at risk. We see this link between pollution that both from exposure to pregnant mothers who breathe in unhealthy air and passing that pollution on to their unborn child. And then also for young children, that is associated with asthma, autism, ADHD, and severe allergies. And together, all of these conditions affect 1 in 4 children. That is a significant amount. And then if we look at adults aren't immune to this either. Latest research is showing anywhere from 200,000 to even up to 350,000 Americans die each year early from exposure to air pollution. And if we think about that in terms of, again, with the COVID pandemic we've just experienced, this is happening every year. and on the scale of what we're seeing with COVID mortality here in the US. And this is often because pollution is linked to lung and heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, dementia, and several other conditions. And so we see life cut short. We see lifelong debilitating conditions because of breathing unhealthy air. And then if we look worldwide, we see that as of 2017, an estimated 9 million premature deaths because of pollution. 16% of all deaths worldwide. And to put that into context, that's 3 times more than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined, and then 10 times more deaths than from war and all forms of violence. Again, this gives us a sense of the scale, that this isn't a problem of the past, that it's not harmless, and it's something that we need to deal with. And then there's also a very clear COVID connection from research that's come out over the past year, finding that air pollution, specifically from soot, has contributed to 18% of COVID-19 deaths in the US, with 15% also, if you break that down, being attributable to air pollution specifically related to the combustion of fossil fuels. And so again, we get that message that this is not something harmless and to be ignored. And then we can look at who is affected by this. With that, over 40% of Americans who breathe unhealthy air, it's distributed across urban, rural, and suburban zip codes. But when we drill down into it, although everyone is affected by it, there are inequalities to exposure. And what we find is that those who are most vulnerable are often impacted the greatest. Again, talking about our children, born and unborn, pregnant women, and their babies. We see the elderly also affected, those with chronic diseases and disabilities also more affected by air pollution, and then communities that live in areas with poor air quality. As it's noted, this is often situated near highways, near main roads, and often affects low-income communities as well as communities of color, where there has been more buildup of highways or of polluting power plants, manufacturing industry that is being built in those areas because it's cheaper, because it's easier to build in low income as well as communities of color. So we see that the greatest impact is on the most vulnerable. And I just want to dig into that last point just a little bit, because here in the US, it turns out that race is one of the most significant predictors that a person will live near contaminated air, water, and soil. And there was a really eye-opening study that came out in 2019 of looking at pollution exposure by different ethnicities and races relative to how much pollution they were able to produce. And that's what this graph is showing, that relative to the average of what each group of pollution that they produce, found that Latino Americans are exposed 63% more than the pollution they're responsible for. For Black American communities, exposed 56% more. And then for white non-Hispanic communities, exposed to 17% less of the pollution that is produced in those communities. And so I think as we look at this and think about the implications of this, what really jumps out to me is that this is just simply unfair. And so also, as we think about healing and reconciliation in our nation, dealing with this inequality and pollution exposure as well as production is something that we can't ignore as well. And then just to quickly look at climate change, what we find is that climate change also impacts these vulnerable populations more than they're more at risk for the impacts of climate change. And again, it's the same story, different song, that children, the elderly, pregnant women, the poor, people of color, people with chronic illness, disabilities, of low income and low wealth are most severely impacted by the impacts of climate change. And so this graphic goes into that a little bit in more detail, of where we see climate impacts from extreme weather, fire, flood, drought, and especially extreme heat. Extreme heat is one of the biggest killers and biggest threats to our health from the natural world. Often we'll think of hurricanes and tornadoes as being the major killers, but actually on average, extreme heat and the inability to get out and get simply cooled down is one of the biggest threats to life caused by climate change. This is especially true for, again, the elderly, low-income communities that may not be able to afford to cool their homes down during a heat wave, as well as children and pregnant women. And so we see that these impacts affect our physical health, our medical health, also through increased allergies, increased exposure to waterborne and vector-borne diseases like ticks. It also impacts our mental health with the anxiety that can come from experiencing an extreme weather event, of losing a home, losing a business, losing your livelihood, losing a loved one to extreme weather and natural disaster. And then we also see it has a community health impact as well. And then just to dig down and look a little bit more at how these climate impacts impact children at different stages of their lives. Again, just like with pollution, we see that it has an adverse effect on mothers and babies, on the outcomes of their pregnancy, leading to those low birth weights, which can carry a raft of different problems, as well as preterm birth that can be triggered by extreme heat events and floods. For young infants with their sensitive development, they're not tiny humans, tiny adults. Their bodies are still being actively developed, and so they're at greater risk for those heat-related illnesses and experiencing asthma. And then up to school-age children who are often out and about at sports, out in the heat, they're at increased risk for heat-related illnesses, at increased risk for being exposed to vector-borne disease or waterborne disease as they're playing outside, whether that's in a forested area or in a lake, as those conditions become more favorable for ticks, more favorable for other waterborne diseases. They're at increased risk of exposure to that. Before I head into the next section, I did just want to do a little temperature check because this is a lot of information. This is heavy information of seeing how pollution, how climate change, which can seem like very big things, how they are impacting, once we really dive into it, impacting those who we love, the communities that we're called to serve, our friends, our families, folks in our church and in our neighborhoods. And so it can feel a bit overwhelming, but we're going to dive into the solution space for the rest of this talk and really look at what we can do. Because as Paul Douglas, who's a meteorologist as well as a Christian, I love what he says, that we are not hopeless and we're not helpless. And one of the things that gives me hope about solving these big problems when it comes to pollution, when it comes to climate change, is the fact that pollution and climate change, they have the same source. This is good news because we can then get a double whammy by addressing the source of the problem. We can address both of these, both the pollution side of things when it comes to particulate matter, when it comes to smog, when we come to heat trapping gases like carbon dioxide and methane. They're often coming from the same source. And so what are those sources? It's coming from the emissions of these pollutants and greenhouse gases from our transport system, from industry and development, from heating and cooling our homes, and even from wildfires. But one of the takeaways I want you to have from this is to focus less on the cars, our homes, development, and focus more on the emissions. Because with the exception of forest fires, which I think we can all agree is not a good thing, our ability to have ready access to transit and mobility through cars and buses and other transport systems, that is a good thing. The ability to heat and cool our homes, that is a good thing. And we need to have that electricity generated for us from power plants. These are good things that have led to the prosperity and longer life expectancies for humans. These things have been good things, but what is not good is the emissions of those pollutants and of those heat trapping gases. And the good news is that we do have the tools and technology to have those same benefits from these modern conveniences, but without as many of the emissions, even to the point of zero emissions when we're talking about certain sources of clean energy. And so again, I think especially as we're talking with friends and family, it's not that cars are bad. It's not that air conditioning is bad. It's just that, can we get that same convenience without the drawbacks of pollution and global warming, which is harming our health and especially the health of the most vulnerable. And so with that, I like to think of clean energy, clean transportation clean transportation options as benefit multipliers. We're able to address two problems, even more problems at the same time by addressing the common source of reducing these emissions. And some of the things that clean energy and clean transportation do, as we've been discussing, it defends our children's health by cutting out that pollution and carbon that's heat trapping gases. It protects God's creation in the process. And as we are on this dawn of shifting to a clean energy economy, it's going to create new family sustaining jobs that are high paying and will support our households, especially if you do it in a just way that makes sure that no one's left behind, with special attention to those communities who are reliant on fossil fuel related jobs, on ensuring that those who have been historically left out of the high wage energy economy, especially communities of color, are included in these job solutions. And so that's where I think of them as these benefit multipliers. So with that, clean energy can feel like a pretty abstract, distant kind of thing. So you may be thinking, what can I do? How can I engage in this solution? And the way I like to think about it is that there's actually a lot that we can do. And often it's at different scales for us to engage in, from ourselves as individuals and households and families, to the group level, which I'd include our churches, our school and college campuses, small businesses, to the local community, to state, national, and even international solutions. And so I want to kind of step through with you today some of these different solutions. So first we'll start with individuals and households. And one of the questions I like to ask when thinking about it at this scale is, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, God gives to Adam and Eve, he gives the garden over to them and says, ask them to tend it and to work it. And so God has also given us a garden, something that we're responsible for stewarding. And so the question I like to think about is, what is that garden God has entrusted to me? It may not be a literal garden, but what it certainly is our household, is our home. It's our purchasing choices. It's even who we're interacting with. And so how then can we tend those things that God has entrusted to us, to stewardship to us through those choices, in a way that honors and glorifies God by being those good stewards of all that he has made. And so luckily, some research colleagues in 2017 made this decision, or deciphering what to do, a little bit easier by mapping out several different personal choices that we can make that helps reduce our personal footprint for pollution as well as carbon emissions. And I'm going to hone in on the things that are in the clean energy space, but looking at, as you probably heard, switching out your light bulbs at home with energy efficient LED lights, using your dryer less, hanging your clothes, washing clothes in cold water, even then to looking at how you replace your car, all the way to living car free. I like to think of this as a buffet of options that we have at our disposal to find which ones work best for our situation and scenario. And doing the ones that make sense with our family, with where we live, with what is feasible. And so to break it down, we can look at, in the clean energy space, for our home energy use. Again, I like to think of these as levels and finding which one works for you. And again, at level 1, looking at buying those LED bulbs, looking at how we do our washer and dryer, which can take a lot of energy. At the next level, does it work with your family or your living situation? Can you adjust the thermostat a couple degrees down in the winter and up in the summer? Some of these are just simple ways to conserve energy. My dad, not for reasons for climate change, but growing up, he was always the light police and would come around and make sure that we had turned off the lights in our rooms, in whatever room we had just left, because of, not for saving on carbon emissions or pollution, because it also saves money. He wanted a lower energy bill, and so would come around and look at doing that. And so these level 1, level 2 options are also not only good for reducing pollution by reducing our energy use, but it's also good with reducing your energy bill. And then level 3, if this makes sense for you, buying renewable energy to power your home. That can look like working with your utility to set a certain percentage of renewable energy that your bill will pay towards. Or that can look like putting solar panels on your home and going that full route. But what I really want you to take away is finding what is right for you in your context, what feels manageable and easy to do to get in on the game. The same with transit. We can look at level 1 of just simply adding more public transit, walking, biking into your routine. This may not be feasible for everyone based on where you live, but is there some trip that you could make without using your car? Level 2, switching to a more fuel efficient vehicle, whether that is still gas powered, but has a higher fuel efficiency to it whenever you purchase your next car, purchasing a hybrid car, and then or going all the way electric, using that buying power that you have to make a choice to select something that is more fuel efficient than you have now when the time comes that you may need to replace your car. Or it could look like that you're in the place where you live. It makes sense that you could live car free, or have one less family vehicle. That makes a big difference. With air travel, same thing. Looking for nonstop flights only is a great way to start. I love saving time, so that's something that I try and do. And then all the way to trying to avoid air flights if you can. Again, these things may work in some contexts, but not in others. And then lastly, as an individual, one of the most important things that we can do is to simply talk about climate change. As Katharine Hayhoe, fellow climate scientist, as well as Christian, gave an excellent TED Talk on, which please do check out if you haven't yet. But the fact is that a lot of us who care and who do see caring for creation, addressing pollution and climate change as key to our faith, aren't talking about it. And one of the key reasons for that is because of this perception that it's not going to be well received, that if we bring it up, that it may start a controversial conversation. But the truth is, as we look at polling, we find that vast majorities of the American population actually believe and recognize that global warming is happening, and they think it'll harm future generations and have a care. They do care about this. But only 35% of Americans have said that they even just occasionally talk about global warming. So there's a lot of room to have productive conversations. And starting with the things that you are doing personally to save energy and reduce your energy use is a great place, a great conversation starter, a great place to start that conversation. And then next, what can we do at the group level for our churches, at our campuses, at our businesses that we work? And I'm going to give a huge shout out to a colleague, Colby May, who is a certified energy manager and who's also a Christian, and his way of living out his Christian mission and witness is through a company, a consulting company that he started, Energy for Missions, and helping churches find those energy savings that allow them to then save on their utility bills and then be able to put that money towards their mission areas. The fact is that 30% of energy in our church buildings is wasted because of inefficient practices, because it's leaking out of inefficient windows, all these different things. Colby will come to your church, do an energy audit, and help you find those solutions of how you can recoup that 30% back. And instead of sending it to the utility company, put it to work for the critical missions that God has called you to. And one thing that I love is that many of those improvements are actually low to no cost at all. And so having someone, an expert eye like Colby, come in and help you through that process is pretty amazing. And there's a lot of other options also for churches to get engaged with this. But some of the folks that Colby's worked with have been key seminaries across the country, as well as key churches. Yeah, just a really great resource right there for getting over that barrier of how do we actually do it. And a lot of churches are then also, as part of this, not only looking for those energy efficient savings, but also using that unclaimed real estate of their roofs and their grounds to put solar installations for their church, which is a blessing both for the church itself, for generating your own energy, saving on those energy costs, as well as producing that clean energy for your community as well. And if installing a solar panel system on your church isn't feasible itself, you can also explore ways to seeing if your utility will allow you to, again, designate that your electricity will come from renewable energy sources. A lot of utilities now offer that flexibility. Also want to point out that here in DC, the Gift of Peace Convent used their grounds to build DC's largest solar array. And not only are they using it as a solar garden, but also using it as a pollinator garden, of using that land also for gardening and to keep our bees in a healthy situation as well. So there's, again, kind of those win-win-wins, benefit multipliers going on with ideas like these. And even at Department of Energy, some colleagues of mine from there have been testing out how can we also grow vegetable gardens underneath solar installations, which is really exciting. Just for time, I'm going to kind of rush through these, but I also wanted to point out, this was an effort back at Georgia Tech where I got my PhD, where my PhD advisor, Kim Cobb, she started a student carbon reduction challenge, which essentially went out, what they did was they identified where they could see some energy savings that would reduce carbon, save energy, and save money. And they would design these projects for local companies in the Atlanta area, all the way up to Fortune 500 companies, city organizations, to help them cut their energy use and cut their carbon emissions and to save money. And it's really incredible what these students came up with. And especially when you scale it up to a building or a company group level. And so simply by raising the thermostat during the summer at one company, they saved 32,000 pounds per year of carbon and saved $5,000. You can see even more here at a synagogue, changed out all of their bulbs to be LED. Saved nearly 500,000 pounds of carbon and $65,000 a year in cost savings that they would recoup from that. I love this one with Delta. What they did is they reduced the weight of the Sky Mall magazines on those flights, which reduced the plane's weight, reduced its fuel consumption, and saved nearly 30 million pounds of carbon a year, and saved $30 million a year just by doing that simple switch. And so how can we get creative and look at ways to reduce pollution, reduce energy use, and save some money? And even Chick-fil-A got in on the game and saved $3.5 million, which is incredible. And all of this together over 10 years was equivalent to 120 homes going 100% solar for 20 years. So as groups working together and finding those key partnerships really had a big impact. And then with your local community, what can you do? I love this example from Inglewood Christian Church in Indiana, where they serve low-income communities in Indianapolis, and realizing that energy costs was a huge burden for those low-income communities that they served. And so what they did was that in building low-income apartments for seniors, they made sure to include energy efficient designs, were able to put up solar panels, put in geothermal heating, and reduce that energy burden and energy cost for those people that they were called to serve in their community. And if this isn't something that's feasible within your context and community, one thing you can also do is partner with local agencies or even your utility to help low-income residents make their homes more energy efficient through weatherization. There are local programs that are funded through the federal government to do just this. But one of the hangups is having people help residents who qualify to go through the paperwork and figure out how to do that. So that could be something that you do in your church community groups or as part of a college campus, partnering with those agencies to help other residents go through the process of getting their homes weatherized and make them more energy efficient and save on their energy costs. You can also look into going together with other congregations or members within your own church to promote community solar in your community, which is where folks come together to ask their utility to build out more renewable energy in their community. And once that's built, they get a credit on their energy bill for subscribing to the system. And that then also blesses the rest of the community with clean energy, which is rapidly has become one of the cheapest forms of energy as well. And then lastly, planting trees is an incredible way to reduce energy burden, heat, illness, and death because of the shade that it produces, that trees produce, as well as filter out and draw down carbon and pollution. I participated in research that shows that across a city, neighborhoods without trees tend to be up to 15 degrees hotter than tree-lined, shady communities and neighborhoods due to the urban heat island effect and because of increased paving. So if we do smart tree planting, that's been shown to be one of the most effective ways to cool down temperatures, which again, provides incredible protection to one's health from heat, illness, and death. During a heat wave, helps save energy since you're not having to use your air conditioner as much, and then removes that carbon naturally from the air, CO2 from that trees draw down. And then also they filter out pollution from the air. So it's a great thing to get involved with your local tree planting community. And then finally, I'm just going to end real quick with what you can do at the state and national level. And I'm just going to give a shameless plug to EN. This is something that we do specifically focusing on policies that look to defend life, protect God's creation, and also boost family sustaining jobs through clean jobs. And I know it's hard to navigate what's a good bill, what's a good policy, what's not. And we do the work for you at EN. So if you'd like to get involved with what we're doing, please do visit creationcare.org. We also have a sister organization, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. So if you've got any young people in your life that are college aged who want to get involved, definitely point them towards that. And then just to really quickly recap, because I know we're at time, just to remind you that caring for creation, it's not radical, it's not a new idea, but it's foundational. It's part of our history and heritage. It's a discipleship issue, and it's a matter of life. And we're not hopeless, we're not helpless. And this is by looking at clean energy, it's actually one of those new ways that we can partner with Jesus in bringing abundant life to our communities. And so with that, I will wrap up and hand it back to Caleb.
Wow. So Man, that's just so good. Thank you for sharing all that. Oh my word. So I've just got like, boom, it's just like so much going on here. And but yeah, I would love to hear from some others. If you have a question, if you want to type that into the chat, and if you've got time, if you have to run, I get it. It's 12 or whatever time where you're at. But if you have a minute and want to do just a little bit of Q&A, I would love for you to type a couple questions into the chat, whatever stuck out to you, or other questions maybe about engaging on a local level or with the church. Yeah, I'd love to hear some of your reactions who are with us today. So feel free to just type that into the chat, and we'll spend a minute here. Again, you'll see there that lifelong learning code is 16289 if you need that. But yeah, I love, it's like, how is it, yeah, shouldn't the church be the proponent, right, and the means of good news when it comes to all of this? Like, how cool would that be if right, that when we talk about what the local church is up to in the world, that the people of God are the ones leading the way when it comes to clean energy and this sort of thing. I mean, I really got big dreams here, but man, it's like that's you know, that's it. And I know we're just skimming the surface of all of this today, but man, there's just so much there. Yeah. Any other questions? Just type them into the chat, or unmute yourself and just fire away. You know, how do we address 3 discussion blockers? I can only guess what's coming here. Yeah, what does it mean to yeah, talk about this in the context of the local church?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start answering as the 3 blockers come up. But yeah, first one, the narrow definition of pro-life. That's a really great question. And how I navigate that is first pointing back to the National Association of Evangelicals, pointing back to the March for Life, that they define pro-life as protecting life from conception to natural death, but then also really honing in on those impacts to unborn children. That if we're looking to defend the sanctity and dignity of life, we need to look at all the aspects, all the things that harm life. And again, if it's helpful to limit it to unborn children, they are specifically vulnerable to pollution and to climate change, both through that through particulate matter and air pollution as that their mothers are exposed to. And often you don't know that you're exposed to it. It's not a responsibility issue. You can't see it. Often we just don't know if we're breathing in this microscopic, invisible, tiny, fine particles. And that has impacts that last a lifetime. And then also you can think about heat as well, of really also being associated with preterm birth as well as stillbirth also. So that would be my suggestion, to point towards those key organizations that they trust that have a broad definition of pro-life, and then also focusing on those effects for unborn children. Let's see, next one. The sin transaction between 2 people in the same room. I'd love a little context on that. So if you want to, so please, if you could add some context, I'll jump down to number 3, the economy. That's a great one too. And what we see is that a switch to the clean energy economy is actually has a lot of potential and opportunities, and it's a myth. It is a myth, and I can point you towards key Republican leaders, conservative leaders who are breaking down that myth that protecting the environment means it must come at the odds of the economy. We can have a strong, healthy environment and a healthy economy at the same time. And one of the ways in the clean energy space that is showing that is that solar, wind, renewables has become on the same level or cheaper than other forms of energy production through fossil fuels like coal and natural gas. And so when it makes that economic case that it makes sense to start, as we are phasing down old power plants, to replace them with solar and wind generating plants. It makes economic sense for that. It also has the opportunity to create a whole lot of jobs, not only in wind and solar, but also in pollution remediation, whether that's plugging abandoned and leaking oil and gas wells that are just leaking pollution into the local community. Those need to be plugged. We need to plug up leaks on our gas pipelines. And so there's a lot of economic and jobs cases to be made for making sure that we have a really robust environment as well.
That's what's up. Yeah, and I see Laura's kind of clarifying there, indirect sin, lifestyle choices. Yeah, so kind of some big questions there. And I will say too, like, you know, this is one thing I feel like this conversation is very helpful in making that shift from focusing on sin and sin-based versus like what loving our neighbor looks like. And I feel like maybe a lot of what you're trying to present for us is finding those common grounds, right? Because you know, loving our neighbor, you know, like preterm births, like these are things that we all care about, right? And so, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great, Caleb. And like, just very quickly, I'll just say that we see throughout scripture that our decisions have descendants. They have consequences that are not just personal to us. We see generational sin in the Bible. We see even just with original sin, wasn't just applied, the consequences weren't applied just to Adam and Eve. It was for all of creation and all of humanity from then until now, and until Christ fulfills with the kingdom coming. And so I think just real quickly, there are examples that show that there are broader consequences. We know that the wages of sin is death, and it's not just personal to us ourselves, but it has great impact. I love this. Oh, there's so many examples, but even in there's one example from Jericho, and that we see Elisha being asked to come to Jericho to heal their polluted water that's become salted, and they attribute it to the sins of Jericho's past. And Elisha, in God's goodness, comes and he heals the water. But again, we see that our choices don't, and our sinful choices don't just stick with ourselves. So pointing to some of those examples might be helpful.
That's such a cool passage. Caleb and Michaela ask, do you have any changes you would recommend or not recommend that you have made in your local church? How'd you go about it? Were there difficulties?
Yeah, I think, and it depends on your context. Are you are you on staff? Are you a lead pastor, or are you a member of your church? And so the strategies with that are a little bit different, and in how you can do it. But the first thing I think is to get as many folks on board as you can. And that first comes with the talking about it and having these discussions of drawing those connections between how whatever you'd like to implement or solutions you'd like to go down, how that connects to what your community already values and what is the mission of your community as well. And I'd really root it in this is our mission, and this is how this solution contributes to our already existing missions and values, whether that is serving low-income communities in your community, helping them to reduce that energy burden. That may be one thing. Tree planting might be one thing. Doing those stewarding your church's finances well by looking for those energy savings can be an option. But I think instead of specific activities, I think the most important thing I'd recommend is getting as many folks on board with you and connecting it with those existing values and mission.
Awesome. Yeah. Other questions? Megan Purdue is saying she would really actually like the names of some of the Republican leaders. So yeah, we could have some follow-up dialogue. Yeah. It is, and that's sort of the thing. So these are kind of the same conversation, right? It's like so much of our cultures, for whatever reason, especially in the last few decades, is really trying to polarize this conversation to say, if you're on this side or you're on this side of the aisle. And I love the thought that the church is the place where we can come together and say, no, this is all common ground, quite literally. And my earth is your earth, and which is all God's earth. And but
yeah, and I'll just say real quickly, if you want to look up the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, that has a long list of Republicans as well as Democrats who have, in one way or another, been willing to raise their hand and say that we recognize this as a problem. And there's some great, I can send along some great quotes with that, things from even like folks like Lindsey Graham. So I've always find that those are handy to have on board. But what Caleb said is absolutely true, especially over the last decade and accelerated over the last several years, is this heightened polarization on this issue. But also I love looking back at history, and what you see throughout even our American political history is that caring for the environment had been for a long time a bipartisan issue. And actually some of the most major developments in environmental policy were put into place under Republican administrations, the EPA, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act under Nixon. George H.W. Bush signed in the Global Chains Research Act. And so making sure, one thing that we do at EN, whenever we do see especially conservative policymakers doing the right thing, we try and give them some love because often they're not receiving that love, and that by doing that, it'll give them that courage to keep on doing the right thing.
That's what's up. Yeah. And I love, and not to belabor all this, but just the idea of, even on the local level, like this is like saving energy is saving money, and all of that is what can be turned around and then given back to, right, charity of your choice, or back to this creation care work. Yeah, so it's just such a no-brainer, I think, across the aisle when you really look at not only the numbers, but the lives involved in all of this. And so right on. Yeah. I know we're at time here over. Jessica is such a wealth of knowledge. So if there's any last questions, feel free to fire away. Maybe we could do a follow-up one of these at some point, dive a little deeper. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Jessica. This is just so good, and I'm so excited that we've recorded this to share. And we're just so thankful for you being here with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun and just a great time to connect with you all. Feel really honored to have the opportunity to join you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, go in peace, everyone. And thanks for your time here with us this morning.